All of the energy in the organisms of an ecosystem originally came from the sun. I want to show you how we can represent how the energy flows through an ecosystem in two ways: a food chain and a food web. Let's start with a simple food chain, and we'll do an example. Okay, so we don't draw the sun in the ecosystem. We start with the organisms that are able to take the energy from the sun and convert it into food. So they're called our producers. So for example, we might start with grasses. Now, when we're drawing how energy flows in an ecosystem, we represent it with arrows, and the arrows go in the direction of the energy flow. So we start with our grass, and then we go to our first consumer, the consumer that eats the producer. And in this case, it's going to be ants. Now, those ants then are eaten by other organisms, other animals, and in this case, it's going to be an echidna. And the echidna then is going to be eaten as well by a dingo. Okay, so here's a very simple food chain. This is a food chain. This food chain demonstrates how energy flows through the ecosystem. Here's some words that we can use to describe each of the different parts. Firstly, the organism that's able to take the energy from the sun and convert it into food is called a producer. And they're primarily plants. The organism that eats the producer is called a first order consumer. Another word we might use to describe this organism is a herbivore. A herbivore eats producers. So then the echidna is a second order consumer, and because the echidna eats other animals, it's called a carnivore. Alright, and so you've probably guessed that dingo is a third order consumer, and obviously is also a carnivore. Now, if we have an organism that eats both plants and animals, well, we've got another name for that, and that's an omnivore. And humans, most humans are omnivores. They eat both plants and animals. So I'll just write that word for you. Omnivore eats both plants and animals. Alright, so that's a food chain. We draw it horizontally, and we demonstrate how the energy flows through the ecosystem from the producer through to the consumers. Now, a food chain is too simple to represent an ecosystem, how the energy flows through an ecosystem, because rarely do you ever have a species of organisms that only ever feed on one type of species. It's usually more complex than that. So we use what we call a food web to try and represent that complexity. So when we write a food web, we actually do it vertically. We start with our producers at the bottom. And again, I'm going to go for grass as our producer. Now, when we go draw the food web, we're going to go vertically, still with arrows going in the direction of energy flow. But each of our levels, we call feeding levels, each of these feeding levels are going to be on a different horizontal level. So, our herbivores that eat the grass, we're going to have three. We're going to have mice, sparrow, and grasshopper. So we've actually got three different types of herbivores that eat the grass. And we draw our arrows in the direction of the energy flow, because these first order consumers get their energy from the grass. Now, in this particular food web, we're also going to have three second order consumers: cat, owl, owl, crow. Now, they also eat a variety of different first order consumers. So the mice are eaten by the cat, but the cat also eats the sparrow. The owl also eats the mouse and also eats the grasshopper, and the crow eats the sparrow and the grasshopper. So as you can see, there's some complexity here. In this particular food web, we also have another level, third order consumer. And in this particular food web, at the top we have the dingo. And the dingo eats the cat, the owl, and the crow. Now, the dingo also eats the mouse. So in this particular case, this is our producer. Now we've got our first order consumers. These are our second order consumers. And our dingo is our third order consumer. Now, we could also say that the dingo, because the dingo also eats the mouse, we can also say the dingo is also a second order consumer. In all ecosystems, there's a limit to the number of feeding levels. And most don't go past a third order consumer, sometimes a fourth. The reason for that is that energy transfer, energy flow through an ecosystem is actually quite inefficient. Only about 10% of the energy from each level is transferred to the next level. And the reason for that is that most energy that an organism consumes doesn't go into adding mass to the organism. It's actually consumed for living, and for movement and just for life. So only 10% of the energy that gets consumed is actually transferred to the next level. So we can represent the energy flow through the ecosystem with a pyramid. So this is the energy that's in the grass. The energy that then is transferred to the next level, to the first order consumers, is only 10% of that. And the energy that transferred through to the second level consumers is only 10% of that. And the energy then that's able to be transferred through to the third order consumers is only 10% of that. So as you can see, there's much less energy available to every level, such that there's going to be much fewer dingoes than there is of the cats and the owls and the crows, etc. And it can't sustain anything above that. So that's how we can represent how energy flows through an ecosystem.